This is Audible.
The New York Times best-selling book, Are the Placebo, Making Your Mind Matter, by Dr. Joe Dispenza. Read by Adam Boyce. Copyright 2014 by Dr. Joe Dispenza. For my mother, Francesca. Preface. Waking up. I never planned on doing any of this. The work I'm currently involved in as a speaker, author, and researcher sort of found me. In order for some of us to wake up, we sometimes need a wake-up call. In 1986, I got the call. On a beautiful Southern California day in April, I had the privilege of being run over by an SUV in a Palm Springs triathlon. That moment changed my life and started me on this whole journey. I was 23 at the time, with a relatively new chiropractic practice in La Jolla, California, and I trained hard for this triathlon for months. I had finished the swimming segment and was in the biking portion of the race when it happened. I was coming up to a tricky turn where I knew we'd be merging with traffic. A police officer with his back to the oncoming cars waved me on to turn right and follow the course. Since I was fully exerting myself and focused on the race, I never took my eyes off of him. As I passed two cyclists on that particular corner, a red four-wheel drive Bronco going about 55 miles an hour slammed into my bike from behind. The next thing I knew, I was catapulted up into the air, then I landed squarely on my backside. Because of the speed of the vehicle and the slow reflexes of the elderly woman driving the Bronco, the SUV kept coming toward me, and I was soon reunited with its bumper. I quickly grabbed the bumper in order to avoid being run over and to stop my body from passing between metal and asphalt. So I was dragged down the road a bit before the driver realized what was happening. When she finally did abruptly stop, I tumbled out of control for about 20 yards. I can still remember the sound of the bikes whizzing by and the horrified screams and profanities of the riders passing me, not knowing whether they should stop and help or continue the race. As I lay there, all I could do was surrender. I would soon discover that I had broken 6 vertebrae. I had compression fractures in thoracic 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12, and lumbar 1, ranging from my shoulder blades to my kidneys. The vertebrae are stacked like individual blocks in the spine, and when I hit the ground with that kind of force, they collapsed and compressed from the impact. The 8th thoracic vertebrae, the top segment that I broke, was more than 60% collapsed, and the circular arch that contained and protected the spinal cord was broken and pushed together in a pretzel-like shape. When a vertebrae compresses and fractures, the bone has to go somewhere. In my case, a large volume of shattered fragments went back toward my spinal cord. It was definitely not a good picture. As if I were in a bad dream gone rogue, I woke up the next morning with a host of neurological symptoms, including several different types of pain, varying degrees of numbness, tingling, and some loss of feeling in my legs, and some sobering difficulties in controlling my movements. So after I had all the blood tests, X-rays, CAT scans, and MRIs at the hospital, the orthopedic surgeon showed me the results and somberly delivered the news. In order to contain the bone fragments that were now on my spinal cord, I needed surgery to implant a Harrington rod. That would mean cutting out the back parts of the vertebrae from 2 to 3 segments, above and below the fractures, and then screwing and clamping 2 12-inch stainless steel rods along both sides of my spinal column. Then they'd scrape some fragments off my hip bone and paste them over the rods. It would be a major surgery, but it would mean I'd at least have a chance to walk again. Even so, I knew I'd probably still be somewhat disabled, and I'd have to live with chronic pain for the rest of my life. Needless to say, I didn't like that option. But if I chose not to have the surgery, paralysis seemed certain. The best neurologist in the Palm Springs area, who concurred with the first surgeon's opinion, told me that he knew of no other patient in the United States in my condition who had refused it. The impact of the accident had compressed my T8 vertebrae into a wedge shape that would prevent my spine from being able to bear the weight of my body if I were to stand up. My backbone would collapse, pushing those shattered bits of the vertebrae deep into my spinal cord, causing instant paralysis from my chest down. That was hardly an attractive option either. I was transferred to a hospital in La Jolla, closer to my home, where I received 2 additional opinions, including one from the leading orthopedic surgeon in Southern California. Both doctors agreed that I should have the Harrington rod surgery. It was a pretty consistent prognosis: have the surgery or be paralyzed, never to walk again. If I had been the medical professional making the recommendation, I'd have said the same thing. It was the safest option. But it wasn't the option I chose for myself. Maybe I was just young and bold at that time in my life, but I decided against the medical model and the expert recommendations. I believe that there's an intelligence, an invisible consciousness within each of us that's the giver of life. It supports, maintains, protects, and heals us every moment. It creates almost 100 trillion specialized cells, starting from only 2, and keeps our hearts beating hundreds of thousands of times per day, and it can organize hundreds of thousands of chemical reactions in a single cell in every second, among many other amazing functions. I reasoned at the time that if this intelligence was real, and if it willfully, mindfully, and lovingly demonstrated such amazing abilities, maybe I could take my attention off my external world and begin to go within and connect with it, developing a relationship with it. But while I intellectually understood that the body often has the capacity to heal itself, now I had to apply every bit of philosophy that I knew in order to take that knowledge to the next level and beyond, to create a true experience with healing. And since I wasn't going anywhere, and I wasn't doing anything except lying face down, I decided on 2 things. First, every day I would put all of my conscious attention on this intelligence within me and give it a plan, a template, a vision with very specific orders. And then I would surrender my healing to this greater mind that has unlimited power, allowing it to do the healing for me. And second, I wouldn't let any thought slip by my awareness that I didn't want to experience. Sounds easy, right? Against the advice of my medical team, I left the hospital in an ambulance that brought me to the home of 2 close friends, where I stayed for the next 3 months to focus on my healing. I was on a mission. I decided that I would begin every day reconstructing my spine, vertebrae by vertebrae, and I would show this consciousness, if it was paying attention to my efforts, what I wanted. I knew that it would demand my absolute presence. That is, for me, to be present in the moment, not thinking about or regretting my past, worrying about the future, obsessing about the conditions in my external life, or focusing on my pain or symptoms. Just as in any relationship we have with anybody, we all know when someone is present or not with us, right? Because consciousness is awareness. Awareness is paying attention, and paying attention is being present and noticing. This consciousness would be aware of when I was present and when I wasn't. I would have to be totally present when I interacted with this mind. My presence would have to match its presence. My will would have to match its will, and my mind would have to match its mind. So for 2 hours, twice a day, I went within and began creating a picture of my intended result. A totally healed spine. Of course, I became aware of how unconscious and unfocused I was. It's ironic, I realized back then, when crisis or trauma occurs, we spend too much of our attention and energy thinking about what we don't want, instead of what we do want. During those first several weeks, I was guilty of this tendency on what seemed like a moment-to-moment basis. In the middle of my meditations on creating the life I wanted with a fully healed spine, I would all of a sudden become aware that I'd been unconsciously thinking about what the surgeons had told me a few weeks prior, that I would probably never walk again. I would be in the midst of inwardly reconstructing my spine, and the next thing I knew, I was stressing over whether I should sell my chiropractic practice. While I was step-by-step mentally rehearsing walking again, I would catch myself imagining what it would be like to live the rest of my life sitting in a wheelchair. You get the idea. So every time I lost my attention and my mind wandered to any extraneous thoughts, I would start from the beginning and do the whole scheme of imagery over again. It was tedious, frustrating, and, quite frankly, one of the most difficult things I've ever done. But I reasoned that the final picture that I wanted the observer in me to notice had to be clear, unpolluted, and uninterrupted. In order for this intelligence to accomplish what I hoped, what I knew it was capable of doing, from start to finish, I had to stay conscious and not go unconscious. Finally, after 6 weeks of battling with myself and making the effort to be present with this consciousness, I was able to make it through my inward reconstruction process without having to stop and start over from the beginning. I remember the day I did it for the first time. It was like hitting a tennis ball on the sweet spot. There was something right about it. It clicked. I clicked. And I felt complete, satisfied and whole. For the first time, I was truly relaxed and present, in mind and body. There was no mental chatter, no analyzing, no thinking, no obsessing, no trying. Something lifted, and a kind of peace and silence prevailed. It was as if I no longer cared about all of the things I should have been worried about in my past and future. And that realization solidified the journey for me, because right around that time, as I was creating this vision of what I wanted, reconstructing my vertebrae, it started to get easier every day. Most important, I started to notice some pretty significant physiological changes. It was in that moment that I began to correlate what I was doing inside of me to create this change with what was taking place outside of me, in my body. The instant I made that correlation, I paid greater attention to what I was doing, and I did it with more conviction. And I did it again, and again. As a result, I kept doing it with a level of joy and inspiration, instead of such a dreadful, compromised effort. And all of a sudden, what had originally taken me 2 or 3 hours to accomplish in one session, I was able to do in a shorter period. Now, I had quite a bit of time on my hands, so I started to think about what it would be like to see a sunset again from the water's edge, or eat lunch with my friends at a table at a restaurant. And I thought about how I would never take any of that for granted. In detail, I imagined taking a shower and feeling the water on my face and body, or simply sitting up while using the toilet, or taking a walk on the beach in San Diego, the wind blowing on my face. These were some of the things that I had never fully appreciated before the accident, but now they had meaning, and I took my time to emotionally embrace them until I felt as if I were already there. I didn't know what I was doing at the time, but now I do. I was actually starting to think about all of these future potentials that existed in the quantum field, and then I was emotionally embracing each of them. And as I selected that intentional future and married it with the elevated emotion of what it would be like to be there in that future, in the present moment my body began to believe it was actually in that future experience. As my ability to observe my desired destiny got sharper and sharper, my cells began to reorganize themselves. I began to signal new genes in new ways. And then my body really started getting better faster. What I was learning is one of the main principles of quantum physics, that mind and matter are not separate elements, that our conscious and unconscious thoughts and feelings are the very blueprints that control our destiny. The persistence, conviction and focus to manifest any potential future lies within the human mind, and within the mind of the infinite potentials in the quantum field. Both of these minds must work together in order to bring about any future reality that potentially already exists. I realize that in that way, we are all divine creators, independent of race, gender, culture, social status, education, religious beliefs, or even past mistakes. I felt really blessed for the first time in my life. I made other key decisions about my healing as well. I set up a whole regime, described in detail in Involve Your Brain, that included diet, visits from friends who practiced energy healing, and an elaborate rehabilitation program. But nothing was more important to me during that time than getting in touch with that intelligence within me, and through it, using my mind to heal my body. At 9.5 weeks after the accident, I got up and walked back into my life, without having any body cast or any surgeries. I had reached full recovery. I started seeing patients again at 10 weeks, and was back to training and lifting weights again while continuing my rehabilitation at 12 weeks. And now, almost 30 years after the accident, I can honestly say that I've hardly ever had back pain since. But that wasn't the end of this adventure. Not surprisingly, I couldn't go back into my life as my same self. I was changed in many ways. I'd been initiated into a reality that no one I knew could really understand. I couldn't relate with a lot of my friends, and I certainly couldn't return to the same life. The things that were once so important to me really no longer mattered, And I started asking big questions like, who am I? What is the meaning of this life? What am I doing here? What is my purpose? And what or who is God? I left San Diego within a short time and moved to the Pacific Northwest, eventually opening a chiropractic clinic near Olympia, Washington. But at first, I pretty much retreated from the world and studied spirituality. In time, I also became very interested in spontaneous remissions, when people healed from a serious disease or condition deemed terminal or permanent, without traditional medical interventions like surgery or drugs. On those long, lonely nights during my recovery when I couldn't sleep, I had made a deal with that consciousness that if I were ever able to walk again, I'd spend the rest of my life investigating and researching the mind-body connection and the concept of mind over matter. And that's pretty much what I've been doing in the nearly 3 decades since then. I traveled to several different countries seeking out many people who had been diagnosed with illnesses and treated conventionally or non-conventionally, either staying the same or getting worse, until all of a sudden they got better. I started interviewing these people to discover what their experiences had in common, so I could understand and document what had made them improve, because I had a passion to marry science with spirituality. What I found was that each of these miraculous cases relied on a strong element of mind. The scientist in me started getting very itchy, becoming even more inquisitive. I became re-involved in attending university classes and studying the latest research in neuroscience, and I advanced my postgraduate training in brain imaging, neuroplasticity, epigenetics, and psychoneuroimmunology. And I figured now that I knew what these people had done to get better, and now that I knew all about the science of changing your mind, or at least I thought I did, I should be able to reproduce it, in both sick people and people who are well who want to make changes to support not only their health, but also their relationships, careers, families, and lives in general. I was then invited to be one of the 14 scientists and researchers featured in the 2004 documentary film, What the Bleep Do We Know? And that movie became an overnight sensation. What the Bleep Do We Know invited people to question the nature of reality, and then try it out in their lives to see if their observation mattered, or, perhaps more accurately put, if their observation became matter. People around the world were talking about the film and the concepts it espoused. In the wake of that, my first book, Evolve Your Brain, The Science of Changing Your Mind, was published in 2007. After Evolve Your Brain had been out for a while, people started to ask me, how do you do it? How do you change? And how do you create the life you want? It soon became the most common question people asked me. So I assembled a team and started teaching workshops across the United States and internationally on how the brain is wired and how you can reprogram your thinking using neurophysiological principles. At first, these workshops were mostly just a sharing of information. But people wanted more, so I added meditations to synergize and complement the information, giving participants practical steps to making changes in their minds and bodies, and, as a result, changes in their lives as well. After I taught my introductory workshops in different parts of the world, people would then ask me, what's next? So, I began teaching another level to the introductory workshop. After that was completed, more folks asked me if I could teach another level, a more advanced workshop. This continued in most of the places where I presented. I kept thinking that I was done, that I'd taught all I could teach, but people kept asking for more, so I'd learn more myself and then refine the presentations and meditations. A momentum developed, and I was getting good feedback. People were able to eliminate some of their self-destructive habits and lead happier lives. Even though up to this point my associates and I had seen only small changes, nothing really significant, people loved the information and wanted to continue the practice. So I kept going where I was invited. I figured that when the time came that they stopped inviting me, I'd know I was done with this work. About a year and a half after our first workshop, my team and I started receiving several emails from our participants, commenting on positive changes they were experiencing from doing the meditations on a consistent basis. A flood of change began to manifest in people's lives, and they were overjoyed. The feedback we received over the next year caught my attention, and that of my staff as well. Our participants began reporting not only subjective changes in their physical health, but also improvements in objective measurements from their medical tests. Sometimes the tests would even come back totally normal. These people were able to reproduce the exact physical, mental, and emotional changes that I studied, observed, and ultimately wrote about in Evolve Your Brain. This was incredibly exciting for me to witness because I knew that anything that is repeatable verges on becoming a scientific law. It seemed as though many folks were sending us emails starting with the same verbiage. "You're not going to believe this." And those changes were now more than coincidence. Then a little later that year, during each of the 2 events in Seattle, some amazing things began to happen. At the first event, a woman with multiple sclerosis, MS, who was using a walker when she arrived, was walking unassisted by the time the workshop was over. At the second Seattle event that year, another woman who had suffered with MS for 10 years started dancing around, declaring that the paralysis and numbness she'd experienced in her left foot were completely gone. You'll read more about one of these women and others like them in the chapters to come. By demand, in 2010, I taught a more progressive workshop in Colorado, where people started noticing that they were shifting their well-being right there during the event. People stood up, took the microphone, and reported some pretty inspiring stories. Around this time, I was also invited to speak to a lot of business leaders about the biology of change, the neuroscience of leadership, and the concept of how to transform individuals in order to transform a culture. After a keynote address to one group, several executives approached me about adapting the ideas for a corporate model of transformation. So, I created an 8-hour course that could be tailored for companies and organizations. And the course was so successful that it spawned our 30 Days to Genius corporate program. I found myself working with business clients such as Sony Entertainment Network, Gallo Family Vineyards, and telecommunications company WOW, originally called Wide Open West, and many others. This led to offering private coaching for upper management. The demand for our corporate programs became so great that I began training a coaching staff. I now have more than 30 active trainers, including ex-CEOs, corporate consultants, psychotherapists, attorneys, physicians, engineers, and PhD professionals who travel all around teaching this model of transformation to different companies. We now have plans to begin certifying independent coaches in using the model of change with their own clients. Never in my wildest dreams had I ever imagined this type of future for myself. I wrote my second book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, How to Lose Your Mind and Create a New One, published in 2012, to serve as a practical how-to companion to Evolve Your Brain. I not only explained more about the neuroscience of change and epigenetics, but also included a 4-week program with step-by-step directions for implementing these changes, based on the workshops I was teaching at the time. Then I did another more advanced event in Colorado, where we had 7 spontaneous remissions of various conditions. One woman, who was living on lettuce because of severe food allergies, was healed that weekend. Other people were healed of gluten intolerance, celiac disease, a thyroid condition, severe chronic pain, and other conditions. All of a sudden, I started seeing some really significant changes in people's health and in their lives, while they retreated from their then current reality in order to create a new one. It was happening right before my eyes. That event in Colorado in 2012 was the turning point in my career, because I could finally see that people not only were being helped to change their sense of well-being, but now also were signaling new genes in new ways, right there during the meditations, in real time, in big ways. In order for someone who had been sick for years with a health condition like lupus to become well during a 1-hour meditation, something significant must have occurred in the person's mind, as well as her body. I wanted to figure out how to measure these changes while they were happening in the workshops, so that we could see exactly what was going on. So in early 2013, I offered a brand new type of event that shot our workshops to a whole new level. For this event, which was in Arizona, I invited a team of researchers, including neuroscientists, technicians, and quantum physicists, with specialized instruments to join me for a 4-day workshop attended by more than 200 participants. The experts used their equipment to measure the ambient electromagnetic field in the workshop room to see if the energy was changing as the workshop progressed. They also measured the field of energy around the participants' bodies and the energy centers of their bodies, also called chakras, to see if they were able to influence these centers. To take these measurements, they used very sophisticated instrumentation, including electroencephalography, EEG to gauge the brain's electrical activity, quantitative electroencephalography, QEEG, to make a computerized analysis of the EEG data, heart rate variability, HRV, to document the variation in time interval between heartbeats and heart coherence, a heart rhythm measurement that reflects the communication between the heart and the brain, and gas discharge visualization, GDV, to measure changes in bioenergetic fields. We did brain scans on many of the participants both before and after the event, so that we could see what was going on in the inner world of people's brains. And we also randomly selected people to scan during the event to see if we could measure any changes in brain patterns in real time during the 3 meditations I led each day. It was a great event. A person with Parkinson's disease no longer had any tremors. Another person with a traumatic brain injury was healed. People with tumors in their brains and bodies found that these growths went away. Many individuals with arthritic pain experienced relief for the first time in years. All of these occurrences were among many other profound changes. During this amazing event, we were finally able to capture objective changes in a scientific realm of measurement and document the subjective changes participants reported in their health. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that what we observed and recorded made history. Later in the book, I'll show you what you're capable of doing by sharing some of these stories. Stories about ordinary people doing the extraordinary. Here was my idea in developing that workshop. I wanted to give people scientific information and then provide them with the necessary instruction on how to apply that information so that they could achieve heightened degrees of personal transformation. Science is, after all, the contemporary language of mysticism. I learned that the moment you start talking in the language of religion or culture, the moment you start quoting tradition, you divide your audience members. But science unifies them and demystifies the mystical. And I discovered that if I could teach people the scientific model of transformation, bringing in a little quantum physics to help them understand the science of possibility, combine it with the latest information in neuroscience, neuroendocrinology, epigenetics, and psychoneuroimmunology, give them the right kind of instruction, and provide the opportunity to apply that information, then they would experience a transformation. And if I could do this in a setting where I could measure the transformation as it was happening, then that measurement of transformation would become more information that I could use to teach the participants about the transformation they had just experienced. And with that information, they could have another transformation, and on it goes, as people begin to close the gap between who they think they are and who they really are, divine creators, making it easier for them to keep doing it. I called this concept information to transformation, and it has become my new passion. Now I offer an introductory online intensive and also personally teach about 9 or 10 3-day progressive workshops a year all around the world, plus 1 or 2 5-day advanced workshops where we have the aforementioned scientists come in with their equipment to measure brain changes, changes in heart function, changes in genetic expression, and energetic changes in real time. The results are nothing short of astounding, and they form the basis of this book. Introduction. Making Minds Matter. The incredible results I've seen in the advanced workshops I offer, and all of the scientific data that has come out of that, have led me to the idea of the placebo. How people can take a sugar pill or get a saline injection, and then their belief in something outside of themselves makes them get better. I began to ask myself, what if people begin to believe in themselves instead of something outside of themselves? What if they believe that they can change something inside of them and move themselves to the same state of being as someone who's taking a placebo? Isn't that what our workshop participants have been doing in order to get better? Do people really need a pill or an injection to change their state of being? Can we teach people to accomplish the same thing by teaching them how the placebo really works? After all, the snake-handling preacher who drinks strychnine and has no biological effects certainly has changed his state of being, right? You'll read more about this in the first chapter. So if we can then begin to measure what's taking place in the brain and look at all of this information, can we teach people how to do it themselves without relying on something outside of them, without a placebo? Can we teach them that they are the placebo? In other words, can we convince them that instead of investing their belief in the known, like a sugar pill or saline injection, they can place their belief in the unknown and make the unknown known? And really, that's what this book is about, empowering you to realize that you have all of the biological and neurological machinery to do exactly that. My goal is to demystify these concepts with the new science of the way things really are, so that it is within the reach of more people to change their internal states in order to create positive changes in their health and in their external world. If that sounds too amazing to be true, then, as I've said, toward the end of the book, you'll see some of the research compiled from our workshops to show you exactly how it's possible. I want to take just a moment to talk about a few things that this book is not about, to clear up any potential misconceptions right from the start. For one, you won't read here about the ethics of using placebos in medical treatment. There's much debate about the moral correctness of treating a patient who isn't part of a medical trial with an inert substance. While a discussion about whether the end justifies such means may well be worthwhile in a broader conversation about placebos, that issue is completely separate from the message this book aims to deliver. You Are the Placebo is about putting you in the driver's seat of creating your own change, not about whether or not it's okay for other people to trick you into it. This book is also not about denial. None of the methods you'll read about here involve denying whatever health condition you may presently have. Much to the contrary, this book is about transforming illness and disease. My interest is in measuring the changes people make when they move from sickness to health. Instead of being about rejecting reality, You Are the Placebo is about projecting what's possible when you step into a new reality. You'll discover that honest feedback in the form of medical tests will inform you if what you're doing is working. Once you see the effects you've created, you can pay attention to what you did to arrive at that end, and do it again. And if what you're doing isn't working, then it's time to change until it is. That's combining science and spirituality. Denial, on the other hand, occurs when you're not looking at the reality of what's happening within and around you. This book also won't question the efficacy of the various healing modalities. Many different modalities exist, and many of them work quite well. All of them have some type of measurable beneficial effect in at least some people, but a complete cataloging of these methods isn't what I want to focus on in this book. My purpose here is to introduce you to the particular modality that has most captured my attention: healing yourself through thought alone. I encourage you to continue using any and all healing modalities that work for you, be they prescription drugs, surgery, acupuncture, chiropractic, biofeedback, therapeutic massage, nutritional supplements, yoga, reflexology, energy medicine, sound therapy, and so on. You Are the Placebo is not about rejecting anything except your own self-imposed limitations. You Are the Placebo is divided into two parts. Part 1 gives you all of the detailed knowledge and background information you need to be able to understand what the placebo effect is and how it operates in your brain and body, as well as how to create the same kind of miraculous changes in your own brain and body, all by yourself, by thought alone. Chapter 1 starts off the book by sharing some incredible stories demonstrating the amazing power of the human mind. Some of these tales relate how people's thoughts have healed them, and others show how people's thoughts have actually made them sick, and sometimes even hastened their death. You'll read about a man who died after hearing he had cancer, even though his autopsy revealed that he had been misdiagnosed. A woman plagued by depression for decades who improved dramatically during an antidepressant drug trial, despite the fact that she was in the group receiving a placebo. And a handful of veterans hobbled by osteoarthritis who were miraculously cured by fake knee surgery. You'll even read some startling stories about voodoo curses and snake handling. My purpose in sharing these dramatic stories is to show the wide range of what the human mind is capable of doing, all on its own, without any help from modern medicine. And hopefully, it will lead you to the question, how is that possible? Chapter 2 gives a brief history of the placebo, tracing accounts of related scientific discoveries from the 1770s, when a Viennese doctor used magnets to induce what he thought were therapeutic convulsions, all the way through the modern day as neuroscientists solve exciting mysteries about the intricacies of how the mind works. You'll meet a doctor who developed techniques of hypnotism after arriving late for an appointment only to find his waiting patient mesmerized by a lamp flame. A World War II surgeon who successfully used saline injections as an analgesic on wounded soldiers when he ran out of morphine, and early psychoneuroimmunology researchers in Japan who switched poison ivy leaves with harmless leaves and found that their test group reacted more to what they were told they were experiencing than to what they actually did experience. You'll also read about how Norman Cousins laughed himself to health, how Harvard researcher Herbert Benson, MD, was able to reduce cardiac patients' risk factors for heart disease by figuring out how transcendental meditation worked, and how Italian neuroscientist Fabrizio Benedetti, MD, PhD, primed subjects who had been given a drug and then switched the drug for a placebo and watched the brain continue to signal the production of the same neurochemicals the drug produced without interruption. And you'll also read a striking new study that's a real game changer. It shows that irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, patients were able to dramatically improve their symptoms by taking placebos, even though they knew full well that the medication they were given was a placebo, not an active drug. Chapter 3 will take you through the physiology of what happens in your brain when the placebo effect is operating. You'll read that in one sense the placebo works because you can embrace or entertain a new thought that you can be well, and then use it to replace the thought that you'll always be sick. That means you can change your thinking from unconsciously predicting that your future is your same familiar past to beginning to anticipate and expect a new potential outcome. If you agree with this idea, then it means that you'll have to examine how you think, what the mind is, and how these things affect the body. I'll explain how as long as you're thinking the same thoughts, they'll lead to the same choices, which cause the same behaviors, which create the same experiences, which produce the same emotions, which in turn drive the same thoughts, so that neurochemically you stay the same. In effect, you're reminding yourself of who you think you are. But hold on. You're not hardwired to be the same way for the rest of your life. I'll then explain the concept of neuroplasticity, and how we now know that the brain is capable of changing throughout our lives, creating new neural pathways and new connections. Chapter 4 moves into a discussion of the placebo effect in the body, explaining the next step of the physiology of the placebo response. It starts out telling the story of a group of elderly men who attended a week-long retreat set up by Harvard researchers who asked the men to pretend they were 20 years younger. By the end of the week, the men had made numerous, measurable, physiological changes, all turning back the clock on their bodies, and you'll learn the secret behind how they did it. To explain that, the chapter also discusses what genes are and how they are signaled in the body. You'll learn how the relatively new and exciting science of epigenetics has basically torched the old-school idea that your genes are your destiny, by teaching us that the mind truly can instruct new genes to behave in new ways. You'll discover how the body has elaborate mechanisms for turning some genes on and others off, which means that you're not doomed to express whatever genes you've inherited. This means that you can learn how to change your neural wiring to select new genes and create real physical changes. You'll also read about how our bodies access stem cells, the physical matter that's behind many placebo effect miracles, to make new, healthy cells in areas that have been damaged. Chapter 5 ties the previous two chapters together, explaining how thoughts change your brain and your body. It begins by asking the question, if your environment changes and you then signal new genes in new ways, is it possible to signal the new gene ahead of the changing of the actual environment? I'll then explain how you can use a technique called mental rehearsal to combine a clear intention with an elevated emotion to give the body a sampling of the future experience, in order to experience the new future event in the present moment. The key is making your inner thoughts more real than your outer environment, because then the brain won't know the difference between the two, and will change to look as if the event has taken place. If you're able to do this successfully enough times, you'll transform your body and begin to activate new genes in new ways, producing epigenetic changes, just as though the imagined future event were real. And then you can walk right into that new reality and become the placebo. This chapter not only outlines the science behind how this happens, but also includes stories of many public figures from different walks of life who have used this technique, whether or not they were fully aware of what they were doing at the time, to make their wildest dreams come true. Chapter 6, which concentrates on the concept of suggestibility, begins with a fascinating but chilling story of how a team of researchers set out to test whether a regular, law-abiding, mentally healthy person who was highly suggestible to hypnosis could be programmed to do something he or she would normally deem unthinkable: shoot a stranger with the intent to kill. You'll see that people have differing degrees of suggestibility, and the more suggestible you are, the better able you are to gain access to your subconscious mind. This is key to understanding the placebo effect, because the conscious mind is only 5% of who we are. The remaining 95% is a set of subconscious program states in which the body has become the mind. You'll learn that you must get beyond the analytic mind and enter into the operating system of your subconscious programs if you want your new thoughts to result in new outcomes and change your genetic destiny, as well as learn how meditation is a powerful tool for doing just that. The chapter ends with a brief discussion of different brainwave states and which are the most conducive to your becoming more suggestible. Chapter 7 is all about how attitudes, beliefs, and perceptions change your state of being and create your personality, your personal reality, and how you can shift them to create a new reality. You'll read about the power that unconscious beliefs exert and have a chance to identify some of those beliefs you've been harboring without realizing it. You'll also read about how the environment and your associative memories can sabotage your ability to change your beliefs. I'll explain more fully that in order for you to change your beliefs and perceptions, you must combine a clear intention with an elevated emotion that conditions your body to believe that the future potential that you've selected from the quantum field has already happened. The elevated emotion is vital because only when your choice carries an amplitude of energy that's greater than the hardwired programs in your brain and the emotional addiction in your body will you be able to change your brain's circuitry and your body's genetic expression, as well as recondition your body to a new mind, erasing any trace of the old neurocircuitry and conditioning. In Chapter 8, I'll introduce you to the quantum universe, the unpredictable world of the matter and energy that make up the atoms and molecules of everything in the universe, which turn out to be really more energy, which looks like empty space, than solid matter. The quantum model, which states that all possibilities exist in this present moment, is your key to using the placebo effect for healing, because it gives you permission to choose a new future for yourself and actually observe it into reality. You'll then understand just how possible it really is to cross the river of change and make the unknown known. Chapter 9 introduces you to 3 people from my workshops who have reported some truly remarkable results from using these same techniques to change their health for the better. First, you'll meet Laurie, who at age 19 was diagnosed with a rare degenerative bone disease that her doctors told her was incurable. Although the bones in Laurie's left leg and hip suffered 12 major fractures over several decades, leaving her dependent on crutches for getting around, today she walks perfectly normally without even needing a cane. Her x-rays show no evidence of any fractures in her bones. Then I'll introduce you to Candace, who was diagnosed with Hashimoto's disease, a serious thyroid condition with a host of complications, during a time in her life when she was resentful and full of rage. Candace's doctor told her that she'd have to take medication for the rest of her life, but she proved him wrong after she eventually was able to turn her condition around. Today, Candace is totally in love with a brand new life and takes no medication for her thyroid, which blood tests show is completely normal. Finally, you'll meet Joanne, the woman mentioned in the preface, a mother of 5 who was a successful businesswoman and entrepreneur, who many considered a superwoman, before she collapsed quite suddenly and was diagnosed with an advanced form of multiple sclerosis. Joanne's condition went downhill quickly, and she was eventually unable to move her legs. When she first came to my workshops, she made only small changes, until one day when the woman who hadn't moved her legs in years walked around the room, completely unassisted, after just 1 hour-long meditation. Chapter 10 shares more remarkable stories from workshop participants, along with the brain scans that go with them. You'll meet Michelle, who completely healed herself of Parkinson's disease, and John, a paraplegic who stood up from his wheelchair after a meditation. You'll read how Kathy, a CEO living on the fast track, learned to find the present moment, and how Bonnie healed herself of fibroids and heavy menstrual bleeding. Finally, you'll meet Guinevere, who went into such states of bliss in meditation that tears of joy ran down her face, and Maria, whose experience can only be described as having an orgasm in her brain. I'll show you the data my team of scientists collected from these people's brain scans so that you can see the changes we witnessed in real time during the workshops. The best part of all of this data is that it proves you don't have to be a monk or nun, a scholar, a scientist, or a spiritual leader to accomplish similar feats. You don't need a PhD or a medical degree. The folks in this book are ordinary people like you. After reading this chapter, you'll understand that what these people did is not magic, or even all that miraculous. They simply learned and applied teachable skills. And if you practice the same skills, you'll be able to make similar changes. Part 2 of the book is all about meditation. It includes Chapter 11, which outlines some simple preparation steps for meditation, and goes over specific techniques you'll find helpful, and Chapter 12, which gives you step-by-step instructions for using the meditation techniques I teach in my workshops, the very same techniques that participants used to produce the remarkable results you'll have read about earlier in the book. I'm happy to say that although we don't have all of the answers yet about harnessing the power of the placebo, all sorts of people are actually using these ideas right now to make extraordinary changes in their lives, the kinds of changes that many others consider practically impossible. The techniques I share in this book need not be limited to healing a physical condition. They can also be applied to improving any aspect of your life. My hope is that this book will inspire you to try these techniques too, and to make possible in your life the same kind of seemingly impossible changes. Author's note: while the stories of the individuals in my workshops who experienced healing are true, their names and certain identifying details have been changed in this book to protect their privacy. Part 1. Information. Chapter 1. Is it possible? Sam Lond, a retired shoe salesman living outside of St. Louis in the early 1970s, began to have difficulty swallowing. He eventually went to see a doctor, who discovered that Lond had metastatic esophageal cancer. In those days, metastatic esophageal cancer was considered incurable. No one had ever survived it. It was a death sentence, and Lond's doctor delivered the news in an appropriately somber tone. To give Lond as much time as possible, the doctor recommended surgery to remove the cancerous tissue in the esophagus and in the stomach, where the cancer had spread. Trusting the doctor, Lond agreed and had the surgery. He came through as well as could be expected, but things soon went from bad to worse. A scan of Lond's liver revealed still more bad news: extensive cancer throughout the liver's entire left lobe. The doctor told Lond that sadly, at best, he had only months to live. So Lond and his new wife, both in their 70s, arranged to move 300 miles to Nashville, where Lond's wife had family. Soon after the move to Tennessee, Lond was admitted to the hospital and assigned to internist Clifton Meador. The first time Dr. Meador walked into Lond's room, he found a small, unshaven man curled up underneath a mound of covers, looking nearly dead. Lond was gruff and uncommunicative, and the nurses explained that he'd been like that since his admission a few days before. While Lond had high blood glucose levels due to diabetes, the rest of his blood chemistry was fairly normal, except for slightly higher levels of liver enzymes, which was to be expected of someone with liver cancer. Further medical examination showed nothing more amiss, a blessing considering the patient's desperate condition. Under his new doctor's orders, Lond begrudgingly received physical therapy, a fortified liquid diet, and lots of nursing care and attention. After a few days, he grew a little stronger, and his grumpiness started to subside. He began talking to Dr. Meador about his life. Lond had been married before, and he and his first wife had been true soulmates. They had never been able to have children, but otherwise had had a good life. Because they loved boating, when they retired they had bought a house by a large man-made lake. Then late one night, the nearby earthen dam burst, and a wall of water crushed their house and swept it away. Lond miraculously survived by hanging on to some wreckage, but his wife's body was never found. "I lost everything I ever cared for," he told Dr. Meador. "My heart and soul were lost in the flood that night." Within 6 months of his first wife's death, while still grieving and in the depths of depression, Lond had been diagnosed with esophageal cancer and had had the surgery. It was then that he had met and married his second wife, a kind woman who knew about his terminal illness and agreed to care for him in the time he had left. A few months after they married, they made the move to Nashville, and Dr. Meador already knew the rest of the story. Once Lond finished the story, the doctor, amazed by what he'd just heard, asked with compassion, "What do you want me to do for you?" The dying man thought for a while. "I'd like to live through Christmas, so I can be with my wife and her family. They've been good to me," he finally answered. "Just help me make it through Christmas. That's all I want." Dr. Meador told Lond he would do his best. By the time Lond was discharged in late October, than when he had arrived. Dr. Meador was surprised, but pleased by how well Lond was doing. The doctor saw his patient about once a month after that, and each time, Lond looked good. But exactly 1 week after Christmas, on New Year's Day, Lond's wife brought him back to the hospital. Dr. Meador was surprised to find that Lond again looked near death. All he could find was a mild fever and a small patch of pneumonia on Lond's chest X-ray, although the man didn't seem to be in any respiratory distress. All of Lond's blood tests looked good, and the cultures the doctor ordered for him came back negative for any other disease. Dr. Meador prescribed antibiotics and put his patient on oxygen, hoping for the best. But within 24 hours, Sam Lond was dead. As you might assume, this story is about a typical cancer diagnosis, followed by an unfortunate death from a fatal disease, right? Not so fast. A funny thing happened when the hospital performed Lond's autopsy. The man's liver was, in fact, not filled with cancer. He had only a very tiny nodule of cancer in its left lobe, and another very small spot on his lung. The truth is, neither cancer was big enough to kill him, and in fact the area around his esophagus was totally free of disease as well. The abnormal liver scan taken at the St. Louis Hospital had apparently yielded a false positive result. Sam Lond didn't die of esophageal cancer, nor did he die of liver cancer. He also didn't die of the mild case of pneumonia he had when he was readmitted to the hospital. He died, quite simply, because everybody in his immediate environment thought he was dying. His doctor in St. Louis thought Lond was dying, and then Dr. Meador in Nashville thought Lond was dying. Lond's wife and family thought he was dying too. And, most important, Lond himself thought he was dying. Is it possible that Sam Lond died from thought alone? Is it possible that thought is that powerful? And if so, is this case unique? 26-year-old graduate student Fred Mason, not his real name, became depressed when his girlfriend broke up with him. He saw an ad for a clinical trial of a new antidepressant medication and decided to enroll. He'd had a bout of depression 4 years previously, at which time his doctor prescribed the antidepressant amitriptyline, Elavil. But Mason had been forced to stop the medication when he became excessively drowsy and developed numbness. He had felt the drug was too strong for him and now hoped the new drug would have fewer side effects. After he'd been in the study for about a month, he decided to call his ex-girlfriend. The two of them argued on the phone, and after Mason hung up, he impulsively grabbed his bottle of pills from the trial and swallowed all 29 that were left in the container, attempting suicide. He immediately repented. Running into the hallway of his apartment building, Mason desperately called out for help and then collapsed on the floor. A neighbor heard his cry and found him on the ground. Writhing, he told his neighbor he'd made a terrible mistake, that he had taken all his pills but didn't really want to die. When he asked the neighbor to take him to the hospital, she agreed. When Mason got to the emergency room, he was pale and sweating, and his blood pressure was 80/40, with a pulse rate of 140. Breathing rapidly, he kept repeating, "I don't want to die." When the doctors examined him, they found nothing wrong other than his low blood pressure, rapid pulse, and rapid breathing. Even so, he seemed lethargic and his speech was slurred. The medical team inserted an IV and hooked it up to a saline drip, took samples of Mason's blood and urine, and asked what drug he'd taken. Mason couldn't remember the name. He told the doctors it was an experimental antidepressant drug that was part of a trial. He then handed them the empty bottle, which indeed had information about the clinical trial printed on the label, although not the name of the drug. There was nothing to do but wait for the lab results, monitor his vital signs to make sure he didn't take a turn for the worse, and hope that the hospital staff could contact the researchers who were conducting the trial. 4 hours later, after the results of the lab tests came back totally normal, a physician who had been part of the clinical drug trial arrived. Checking the code on the label of Mason's empty pill bottle, the researcher looked into the records for the trial. He announced that Mason had actually been taking a placebo, and that the pills he had swallowed contained no drugs at all. Miraculously, Mason's blood pressure and pulse returned to normal within a few minutes. And as if by magic, he was no longer excessively drowsy either. Mason had fallen victim to the nocebo, a harmless substance that, thanks to strong expectations, causes harmful effects. Is it really possible that Mason's symptoms had been brought on solely because that's what he'd expected to happen from swallowing a huge handful of antidepressants? Could Mason's mind, as in the case of Sam Lond, have taken control of his body, driven by expectations of what seemed to be the most probable future scenario, to the extent that he made that scenario real? Could that happen, even if that meant his mind would have to take control of functions not normally under conscious control? And if that were possible, could it also be true that if our thoughts can make us sick, we also have the ability to use our thoughts to make us well? Janice Schoenfeld, a 46-year-old interior designer living in California, had suffered with depression since she was a teenager. She had never sought help with the condition until she saw a newspaper ad in 1997. The UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute was looking for volunteer subjects for a drug trial to test a new antidepressant called venlafaxine, Effexor. Schoenfeld, whose depression had escalated to the point where the wife and mother had actually entertained thoughts of suicide, jumped at the chance to be part of the trial. When Schoenfeld arrived at the institute for the first time, a technician hooked her up to an electroencephalograph, EEG, to monitor and record her brainwave activity for about 45 minutes. And not long after that, Schoenfeld left with a bottle of pills from the hospital pharmacy. She knew that roughly half the group of 51 subjects would be getting the drug, and half would receive a placebo, although neither she nor the doctors conducting the study had any idea which group she had been randomly assigned to. In fact, no one would know until the study was over. But at the time, that hardly mattered to Schoenfeld. She was excited and hopeful that after decades of battling clinical depression, a condition that would cause her to sometimes suddenly burst into tears for no apparent reason, she might finally be getting help. Schoenfeld agreed to return every week for the entire 8 weeks of the study. On each occasion, she had answered questions about how she was feeling, and several times she sat through yet another EEG. Not long after she started taking her pills, Schoenfeld began feeling dramatically better for the first time in her life. Ironically, she also felt nauseated, but that was good news because she knew that nausea was one of the common side effects of the drug being tested. She thought that she surely must have gotten the active drug if her depression was lifting and she was also experiencing side effects. Even the nurse she spoke to when she returned every week was convinced Schoenfeld must be getting the real thing because of the changes she was experiencing. Finally, at the end of the 8-week study, one of the researchers revealed the shocking truth. Schoenfeld, who was no longer suicidal and felt like a new person after taking the pills, had actually been in the placebo group. Schoenfeld was flawed. She was sure the doctor had made a mistake. She simply didn't believe that she could have felt so much better after so many years of suffocating depression simply from taking a bottle of sugar pills. And she'd even gotten the side effects. There must have been a mix-up. She asked the doctor to check the records again. He laughed good-naturedly as he assured her that the bottle she had taken home with her, the bottle that had given Schoenfeld her life back, indeed contained nothing but placebo pills. As she sat there in shock, the doctor insisted that just because she hadn't been getting any real medication, it didn't mean that she had been imagining her depression or her improvement. It only meant that whatever had made her feel better wasn't due to Effexor. And she wasn't the only one. The study results would soon show that 38% of the placebo group felt better, compared to 52% of the group who received Effexor. But when the rest of the data came out, it was the researchers' turn to be surprised. The patients like Schoenfeld, who had improved on the placebos, hadn't just imagined feeling better, they had actually changed their brainwave patterns. The EEG recordings taken so faithfully over the course of the study showed a significant increase in activity in the prefrontal cortex, which in depressed patients typically has very low activity. Thus the placebo effect was not only altering Schoenfeld's mind, but also bringing about real physical changes in her biology. In other words, it wasn't just in her mind, it was in her brain. She wasn't just feeling well, she was well. Schoenfeld literally had a different brain by the end of the study, without taking any drug or doing anything differently. It was her mind that had changed her body. More than a dozen years later, Schoenfeld still felt much improved. How is it possible that a sugar pill could not only lift the symptoms of deep-seated depression, but also cause bona fide side effects like nausea? And what does it mean that the same inert substance actually has the power to change how brain waves fire, increasing activity in the very part of the brain most affected by depression?